Well, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
So this morning, something crazy happened. I almost got into a fight this morning. I'm a nice guy, but sometimes I do get angry. And I think maybe I was a little too hasty in my anger this morning, because this morning I was driving and I got honked at. And I didn't really like it. And then there were several more honks. So, I stopped the car, I got out, and I was like, "You want a piece of me?" I don't know why you guys are laughing. Why are you guys laughing? This is very serious. This is very serious. I'm confessing something to you. So I got out, and I was like, "You want a piece of me?" A couple more honks, and I was like, "All right, I guess this is happening," and I started walking. But thankfully, as I started walking up, he stopped honking, flapped his wings, and flew away. Stupid goose. So, want to say thank you to everyone who was able to make it yesterday. Our parking lot was literally full. We had a lot of people from our church, but people were filling in Jackson Morrow Park, and once they got full, they started coming out this way. And so we had a really good time, and I think it was just an incredible sight to see. Again, it was just phenomenal. And so as we worship this morning, I want to guide our minds towards the idea of Jesus coming back. Jesus compared his return to the days of Noah when the flood came. Noah built that ark, protecting his family from that global flood. It was unexpected. It was unpredicted. And Jesus says, that's how my return is. Jesus says, for as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. He says, as in the days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day when Noah entered the ark. And they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. This one Danish philosopher gave a parable about life. He said there's this theater, and they were having a variety show, and each show was more fantastic than the last, and everyone was applauding by the audience. And suddenly the manager comes forward on the stage. He apologizes for the interruption and informs everyone that the theater's on fire, and he asks the patrons to leave in an orderly fashion. And the audience, thinking that this is just the most amusing turn of events, they just started cheering even more thunderously, applauding. The manager again says, "Please leave the building. It is on fire." And and even more, they vigorously applauded even more. And at last he could do no more, and the fire swept through the building and took the fun-loving audience with it. The philosopher concluded, and so will our age, I sometimes think, go down in a fiery destruction to the applause of a crowded house of cheering spectators. I thought that's very similar to what Jesus is talking about. The world's end. It's no secret that the world is going to end. It's going to happen at some point. And yet the people in the world continue as if it's not going to happen. In fact, the people in the world, a lot of the times what we find are people amused by the fact that the end of the world could come, that they are kind of spectating and they're watching it closer and closer without a worry in their hearts. And today we're looking at really Matthew chapter 24 and kind of 25, because it's a chapter that's often misunderstood and misinterpreted, because whenever we come to this concept of when is Jesus going to come back and what's going to come with it, there's a lot of difficulty when we look at Matthew chapter 4, because a lot of people will go to it and look at this symbolism and this vivid descriptions and say, that's the end of the world. And we neglect the idea that sometimes God uses this fantastical apocalyptic language to describe his wrath upon a nation, and sometimes about God's love coming to save his children. See, in Matthew 24, it's a very difficult chapter because you see all these phrases that initially make us think of the end of the world. And sometimes these do sound a little bit like the end of the world, and sometimes it's just because we've been using it that way. We have this habit of hearing these apocalyptic phrases and thinking, this is the end, right? We hear about wars and rumors of wars. We think it's the end. Famines, earthquakes, nations against nation, sun be darkened, delivering up to tribulation, false Christ, false prophets, the Son of Man coming in the clouds. He's sending his angels, all of it. We hear these things and we immediately think that's the end of the world. But I think there's a big problem here, because if this is the end of the world right here, then Jesus contradicts himself. Because when you're reading Matthew chapter 4, there are blatant surface errors. There are problems in here whenever Jesus says one thing and then he turns around and says the exact opposite. And if Jesus is who he said he is, he wouldn't be mistaken or wrong, so we must not be understanding these passages properly. Because in the middle of chapter 24, he says, here are all the signs that are going to happen right before the end. But then, towards the end of the chapter, he says, well, there are actually not going to be any signs before the end. Like, you see the contradiction there? He said, no, Jesus said at the beginning, he's like, well, there's going to be wars, there's going to be famines, earthquakes, persecution, false prophets, armies at Jerusalem, and that's how you'll know it'll be the end. But then he turns around and says, well, right before the end, there's nothing. And so on one hand, he's saying, look at all these signs. When you see the signs, that's when you know. It's like a vulture is crowding around a corpse. It's like leaves on a fig tree. This is how you're going to know. You're going to be able to see the events and determine what's going to happen. And then he turns around and says, well, actually, no one knows when I'm going to come back. It's going to be like a thief in the night. It's going to be like the days of Noah. There are going to be no signs. Well, this is pretty confusing, isn't it? Because Jesus says, when you see all these things, know that it's near. But then he says, oh, the Son of Man is coming at an hour you don't expect. And it's kind of like, what are you talking about? What's going on? It's confusing because it sounds like he's contradicting himself. Because at the end of the day, if he's talking about the same event both times, he is contradicting himself. So the conclusion must be, he's not talking about the same thing. So again, whenever we come to these passages, just because it sounds like something doesn't mean it is this something. Because when we're talking about the return of Jesus, this is usually one of the passages they come to. And it sounds like the end of the world, doesn't it? Let's read. Immediately, after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from heaven, the power of the heavens will be shaken. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. It's like, how is that not the end of the world? Well, you got to keep the context in. You got to remember, it wasn't written to Christians for the 21st century. We hear these things, the sun darkening, the stars falling, the Son of Man coming in the clouds, and we just automatically think, oh, it's the end of the world. And I guess part of my lesson this morning is letting you know, no, it's not. See, Isaiah, this is something that all the Old Testament prophets love to do, and Jesus carries this tradition. They would use these dramatic, fantastical descriptions for something that is maybe more mundane than we expect. Isaiah said, the day of the Lord is coming. When you hear the day of the Lord, a lot of people think, well, that's the end of the world, right? But then he says, the stars are not going to shine. The sun's going to be darkened. You're like, well, that sounds like the end of the world. But it's not, because literally, in that chapter, he says these phrases, and then he tells you what he's talking about. He's talking about God sending one nation to destroy another nation. That's what he's talking about. And so when God is punishing this nation with another nation, Isaiah describes this event as if it's the day of the Lord is coming. The stars aren't going to shine. The sun's going to be darkened. And so when we read language like this, understand it's filled with heavy symbolism. Understand that it's God trying to communicate something big, right? Like when you see one nation going against another nation, you might think, oh, this is just normal happenings. But Isaiah is trying to say, no, you don't understand. Something big's happening that you're not seeing. Something spiritual. This is God's doing. This is God punishing and displaying His wrath. And so when you read this big language, this apocalyptic language, remember, it's not necessarily the end of the world. And so when we come to this chapter, Matthew 24, and we're trying to decipher what about Jesus' return, right? When we're trying to decipher if there are going to be signs before Jesus' return, then maybe we should be on the lookout, shouldn't we, as Christians? Right? And if there aren't going to be signs, well, then we need to know that too. And so we come to this difficult passage trying to decipher Jesus' return, and we see the context. We see that this is a conversation between Jesus and His disciples, where they're out in the temple, and His disciples are pointing out to the buildings of the temple, and Jesus says, you see all these, the buildings of the temple? He says, well, actually, not one stone is going to be left. So He's saying, you see all these buildings? At one point, they're going to be all destroyed. This temple that is the dead center of Israel, theologically, that is their key to their religion, He says, it's going to be destroyed. And so the disciples, upon hearing that, they're thinking, oh, how's that going to happen? They said, let us know. What are the signs going to be? How's the end of this age going to come? Right? And they're saying, if these things are going to happen, how? And how are we going to know this is going to happen? This is like finding out, oh, did you know Kokomo is going to be destroyed? And then you're kind of like, I would like to know how that's going to happen, and I would like to know what's going to happen before it, so I can get out of the town before it happens. And that's this conversation we're having. And so Jesus is talking to His disciples and saying, listen, this is how it's going to happen whenever the temple and the city of Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. And then you dive into this. You see, Jesus, he says, here are a couple of signs. Here are a couple of signs. And He says, here are some signs, but it's not the end yet. Here are some signs, and then the end's going to happen. And here are some things that are going to happen with the end. And so it's almost as if you're walking on a crosswalk, right? Say you're walking on a crosswalk, and across from you, I know a lot of the crosswalks have that hand and a countdown, but let's pretend like it's a green light, yellow light, red light. And you're walking along the crosswalk, and as long as you got a green light to walk along, the cars are stopped. But whenever you hit that yellow light on that crosswalk, you're going to be in the middle of the road. That yellow light means you better hurry up. If you haven't started walking, you better start. If you're in the middle of walking, you better go. If it's going to take you a second, you might as well not go at all, right? Then you hit the red light. And so when the red light happens and you're in the middle of the street, you are in danger. And so you're trying to read that traffic light to get a sense of what you need to do, and that's what Jesus has kind of given us. Here are some signs and how to think of them and what to think, right? So He starts off in this chapter, and I really want to encourage you to read chapters 24 and 25 on your own, because I don't have time to just read them all this morning. He starts talking about this. Jesus says, well, there are going to be some false Christs, people claiming to be Christ. They're going to mislead people. And He says, there are going to be wars and rumors of wars. There are going to be famines. There are going to be earthquakes. And you're like, oh man, is this the end of the world? No. People love to say wars and rumors of war before the end. And I'm like, that is literally the opposite of what Jesus said. Because if you read, verse 6, He says, there are going to be wars and rumors of wars, but the end will not be yet, right? He says, see that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. These things are going to happen, but that's not the end. He says all of these are the beginning of birth pains. It's kind of like when a woman is pregnant, you know it's going to happen at some point. She's going to go into labor, but that labor, I'm sorry, ladies, I understand. Well, maybe I don't understand. But that labor is a long process. God bless you guys. But the beginning of it, you're like, okay, it's kind of about to start. You're waiting for a certain point to go to the hospital because you're in for a long ride. Again, God bless you, ladies. But that's what Jesus is saying. He's saying, okay, that may be the beginning, but you're not at the end yet. You still got time to cross that walk. You can still cross the road. You're safe. You're at a green light right now. There are things that are going to pop up, but nothing to worry about just yet. And then you start hitting that yellow light. Jesus says, well, there's going to be persecutions. Some Christians are going to fall away because of the persecutions. There are going to be more false prophets. There's going to be lawlessness, meaning that the community is going to be pretty chaotic. This is going to be a time of chaos, right? And remember, he's talking about the temple. Remember, he's talking about the temple and the destruction of the temple. What happens before the temple is destroyed? And that's what he's talking about. But in the midst of all this, he's talking to his disciples. He's like, when you start to see these things, remember, he says, the one who endures to the end will be saved. And a big thing, he says, the gospel will be proclaimed throughout the world, and then the end will come. Remember, when he says the end, what's he talking about? The end of the temple, the end of the city of Jerusalem. He's not talking about the end of the world. We hear the end, and we're thinking the end of the world. Context, right? And so Jesus talks about this abomination of desolation, which you're not going to understand unless you dive real deep into the book of Daniel. But really, Luke says, he doesn't say that phrase. He says instead, when you see armies surrounding you, whenever a barricade is around the city, he says, that's when you need to leave. That's when you need to get out of Dodge. That's when you need to run and away, right? Because if you are in Jerusalem and the city of Jerusalem is about to get destroyed, then you might want to get out of the city of Jerusalem, right? And that's what Jesus says. When you see this happening, you need to get out. Because if this was the end of the world, you wouldn't need to run away because there's no escaping it. But he uses these phrases to describe it. The Son of Man is coming. We hear that and think, that's the end of the world. That's not the way Jesus is using it here. And so we hit this red light where hopefully you've already gotten out of Jerusalem because by now it's a little too late. And Jesus starts to use that apocalyptic language that we just read, where he talks about the sun's darkened, the stars are falling, right? The whole earth is mourning, right? The Son of Man coming in the clouds. What's he talking about? He's talking about an army surrounding Jerusalem, destroying the city. So when Jesus says the Son of Man coming in the clouds, he's talking about the city being destroyed. And you're like, okay, how does that make sense? Well, if you dig into other parts of the Bible, you find out that a lot of the times when God comes into the clouds, like God will, it's kind of an imagery where God is soaring through the clouds to go accomplish something. And sometimes he soars through the clouds to come rescue people, and sometimes he soars through the clouds to punish people. So when the Son of Man is coming in the clouds, this isn't the end of the world. This is him bringing judgment upon Jerusalem. You look at history, 40 years, almost exactly after Jesus died, Jerusalem was destroyed. The temple was wiped out. Why? Why would God destroy Jerusalem? I'm willing to bet it's because I don't think I have a strong verse for this, but I think God was judging the city of Israel for killing Jesus. And I think he was showing all the world that the temple is no longer, that the old covenant's no longer, that God wants you to be saved through Jesus. And I think that was his final sign for it. But either way, this is the destruction of the temple. This is a terrible thing. And this is this red light where if you haven't gotten out yet, it's going to be really, really bad. And this is really important because when someone brings up this passage of Matthew 24, that first half where they're talking about, see, the Son of Man is coming in the clouds. That's Jesus returning. We'll point them to a verse just right after this. It says, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. And that right there should kind of solve it, right? Where it's like, okay, is this truly the end of the world? No, Jesus said it's going to happen in that generation. And in that generation, Jerusalem was destroyed. Like I said, 40 years after Jesus died. But then you have this shift, right? You're like, okay, all of that's not talking about the end of the world. Okay, that's the destruction of Jerusalem. Okay, yeah, sometimes God uses fantastical language to talk about him demonstrating his wrath or his love. Okay, really? Great. Well, Jesus continues, and he makes this shift where now he's talking about his return. He's like, okay, that was the end of the world of the temple. That was the end of the world of Jerusalem. For them, it was the end of the world. But let's actually talk about when Jesus does come back. And so this is when we can tune in and say, okay, let's hear what's going to happen before Jesus comes back, right? What are we going to talk about? Are we going to talk about all those beasts in Revelation? Are we going to talk about a giant famine? Are we going to talk about a giant pandemic? Oh, that would never happen, right? Are we going to talk about an eclipse? Oh, that would never happen, right? What are we going to talk about? What are the signs that are going to happen before? Well, first off, Jesus says this, concerning that day or an hour, no one knows. Not even the angels of heaven, not even the Son. Jesus says, I don't even know when I'm going back. Only the Father knows. And you know what that means? That means you won't be able to see it coming. You know, Jesus is very loving in trying to explain to his disciples how to escape this trouble. But whenever it comes to Jesus' return, there are going to be no signs. This passage, we read part of it. For as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day when Noah entered the ark. And they were unaware until the flood came and swept them away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. So, the Lord coming back. When the Lord came and punished Jerusalem, you could see that coming. But here, he's not coming back. I mean, you won't know when he's coming back. And so the first half, you say, well, that's the sign that Jesus is coming back. But then he says, well, there's not going to be a sign when Jesus is coming back. You see what I mean when I say, he says there's going to be a sign, then there's going to be no sign. So he has to be talking about two different things. So now he's talking about his actual return. How often do you hear people talking about the end of the world? I mean, it's every month, right? Every other month. Especially in a time like now that's kind of tumultuous. Especially in a time where things are a little bit crazier, where every single, act of war seems like, oh, this is World War III. We've been saying that for 10 years. And at some point it might be true, but every single time something happens, how often do you see Christians trying to theorize the end of the world? How often do you see Christians saying, well, because of Russia and China and this vision and revelation, the end of the world is coming soon? How often do you hear that? And I'm thinking to myself, okay, you are able to calculate and figure out when Jesus is returning. That's pretty impressive because not even Jesus could do that. Because even Jesus said, I don't know when I'm coming back, but you do? That doesn't quite make sense. How often do we focus on end times? We dive into Revelation, we dive into the book of Daniel, trying to figure out, okay, when is Jesus coming back? You see, Jesus just walks through, and he gives a lot of details that I'm not going to be able to dive into. He talks about some are going to be taken and others are going to be left, right? He's going to talk about a thief's going to break in the middle of the night, and you can't predict when a thief's going to break in. And he's going to talk about all these things, but throughout it, he has the same message. If you don't know when Jesus is coming back, the only choice you have is to always be ready. And so Jesus gives this encouragement. He's like, listen, be ready right now, right here, today, because it could happen today. It could happen tomorrow. It could happen a week from now. But you won't know. And so the only choice you have, be ready today, every day. He says, stay awake, because you don't know when it's coming. Verse 44, you must be ready, because you won't expect it. 25, verse 13, watch, be watchful, be vigilant. Again, because you don't know when it's going to happen. We have to be ready. And we've said this before a couple weeks ago in our Bible class, because at the end of the day, if you knew when it was coming, you know what everyone would be doing? They would be waiting until the night before, wouldn't they? If you know Jesus was coming back on Saturday, a lot of people would probably try to get all their sinning out all the way up to Friday. And then on Friday night, they would get on their knees and say, God, I'm so sorry for what I did, as if you could fool God. And God doesn't want that fake, I'm trying to get ready. I've had conversations with people, and I've told them, listen, when Jesus returns, You're not going to be able to utter such an amazing prayer that He'll forgive everything that you've done in the past. And they're like, oh yeah, I can. Like, no, that's not how it works, because God knows that's fake. What God wants is just every day. I mean, God's willing to forgive. I'm not saying He's not. But what He wants is a true, genuine faith in Him. A willingness to obey and to submit. He doesn't want you to just avoid punishment. He wants your genuine faith to walk in love every day. Jesus compares it to, He gives several parables. He says it's kind of like when a master expects his servant to do something and the servant doesn't do it, and the master comes back and the master's mad. It's kind of like a bridesmaid, right? When the bridesmaid didn't have enough oil for their lamps and they didn't bother to get prepared and to have enough oil for their lamps, that's what it's like. Well, when the person comes back and you need to be ready, you weren't ready. That's how Jesus says. Or do you want to be the kind of person that isn't ready? That if we heard a trumpet right now, if Jesus really did come back right now, would you be ready? Do I know He's going to come back today? No. But I don't know He won't. And throughout life, we're just going to see plenty of judgment. We're going to see plenty of predictions. And we've seen plenty. I mean, at this point, we've had so many doomsday scenarios in life that we really need one of those cards where you can punch it every time. And once you get to the 10th doomsday, you get like a free soda or something. Because that's what it kind of feels like. Because every time something happens, it's like, oh, this is the end. And it's not always Christian. It's sometimes, people will leave God out of it and still think it's the end of the world. Again, oh, did you hear what's happening with Iran and Israel? Here's World War III. Oh, here's the nuclear apocalypse. It's going to happen. Oh, because of climate change, it's going to happen. And we're always talking about, the end of the world. Or things that we've seen. The Mayan calendar. 2012. Didn't happen. I knew people who were up and ready that day, wanted to see if it happened. The preacher with that billboard, his name is Harold Camping. He has predicted the end of the world, the return of Jesus, 4 different times. 4 times. He predicted it once, didn't happen. He's like, oh, it's actually 6 months later. He predicted it again. I forget what year it was. I think it was 2011. Didn't happen. He bumped it back another 6 months. And it just so happens that every time this happens, he convinces people to give away all of their possessions, and so he gains millions of dollars in doing so. Like, God will take care of that. Remember Y2K? I don't, but you guys probably do. The COVID pandemic? Oh man, so many people were saying, is this the end? Is this gone? Right? I mean, some people thought, oh, this is the start. This is Antichrist. This is how God's going to start His judgment. I mean, why do we think this way? Right? When something big happens in our world, why is it just seems part of human nature to think this is the end? Especially for Christians who believe that the end will come at some point. When something big, whether it's like something global, or something just on a big scale, like the eclipse, that wasn't global, but it was a big scale, right? It was something that you couldn't miss, right? We just immediately think it's the end of the world. It comes from this belief that we think the end of the world is going to be preceded or come with big events. That's why we think that. When you see big events and think it's the end of the world, what you believe is that the end of the world is going to coincide with big events. In this passage, the verses we read, Jesus says it's not going to happen. We have to get that in our heads and realize the end of the world, the return of Jesus, is not going to coincide with big events. Maybe big events will coincide with maybe like the destruction of Jerusalem, but God is not going to end this world with something like an asteroid, worldwide famine, pandemic. We think, how is God going to end the world? And Jesus told us, suddenly and unexpected. If you think something big's going to happen before Jesus comes back, you need to listen to the verses we've read. You need to go back and read Matthew chapter 24 and 25. We're going to hear these predictions all the time as Christians. We're just going to hear them all the time. When you hear them, remember the words of Jesus. Jesus' return is going to be like the days of Noah. They didn't see it coming. It was unexpected, and it just happened. And that the only choice we have is to be ready every day. And that whenever you hear these predictions, I think to myself, probably not, but I'm going to act as if it was true. Right? I mean, I hear these predictions and I think to myself, if he comes, great. If not, great. Praise God either way. I think to myself, as if we knew the world was going to end today and every day, what do? We love. We walk in the truth. We walk in the light. The predictions are going to come and go, but how we live our lives is not going to change. We're going to live every day as if Jesus is coming back. We're going to be ready every day. There's not going to be a sign. There will be no sign. Is that it? I think it's just a jet. Like I said, what if it was, right? You know what I mean? What does that mean for you and me? Just serve God. Come to God and say, God, I want to be ready today and every day. I'm not saying you won't have bad days, but just that commitment to say, God, I want to walk in your light. I want to walk in your love. I want to be in your grace. I want to believe that through the sacrifice of Jesus, my sins have been washed away. I want to know that because I connected with your sacrifice and dying and being buried and being resurrected with you in the waters of baptism, I want to have this comfort of knowing that if it was today, I'd be ready. Not because I'm having a good day, not because I'm doing really great, but because I've received your love and I am living by faith, that I am trusting in you. And so, if he did come, I'm not saying it wouldn't be scary, but I'm saying you would be excited. Are you ready? That's just my simple end. Are you ready? If you find yourself not ready, I want to encourage you to answer the invitation. I want to encourage you to find someone to talk about it. I want to encourage you today to get on your knees and pray, to consider how you can get right with God, whether it's being baptized, whether it's just saying, God, I've fallen off the path and I'm going to do better, whether it's going to someone and saying, hey, could you help me? I want to encourage you to get ready. The elders are going to be back and I'm going to be here in the front. If you're not ready, answer the invitation as we sing this next song.